I'm delighted to welcome Scheherazade Semsar. She and I worked closely together while I was the NATO Deputy Secretary General in Brussels, and we had many interesting conversations there about the role of the media in Europe and the subtle differences and some not so subtle differences with how the media operates in the United States. So I thought that this would be an excellent opportunity to make this audience aware of what the issues will be coming up as President Joe Biden and his team work to reestablish strong relationships with not only the NATO alliance, which pleases me very much. That's been very high on the U.S. agenda, very clear about that, but also with the European Union, which sometimes gets a little less attention, but nevertheless deserves a lot of attention from the administration, seeing as there was so much pressure on the EU-Washington relationship during the administration of President Trump. So I'm delighted to welcome Scheherazade again, and very, very happy for this opportunity.
I'm delighted to be here and seeing you again.
Thank you. I have to say that you have her bio, so without further ado, I am going to turn the floor over to her, but she is a Hoya, so Hoya Saxa. The floor is yours. I'll begin with the question that when you and I first met in Brussels while I was Deputy Secretary General, we talked about the differences between Politico USA and Politico Europe. As the CEO of Politico Europe, you told me about the nuances, as I mentioned a moment ago, in story coverage. I was really fascinated then. So could you talk through that for the audience?
Sure. Thank you again for having me. It's a real pleasure. Now, so Politico launched in Europe and decided to put its headquarters in Brussels, where the European Union is based. It was a difficult decision because not everyone thought Brussels was sexy enough in the European Union to actually go and start a whole media company out there. We actually believed there was a real story to cover. However, Brussels is not Washington. And the European Union is definitely not Washington, D.C. The way the powers are organized, we had to cover the story of 28 different countries, which were meeting up in Brussels. We had to become their must-read in English every morning. And what we realized is that there was really two sets of voices, and this is something which did not exist in Washington. First of all, there are the international media, so the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Economist, FT, and they're going to be commenting the story. They're like commentators. And then you've got 28 different countries who have national media, and we'll talk about that because there is no European media as such. The national media are going to be covering the story as from cheering for their team. This is a game, and they're going to be cheering for their team. So, and we came in thinking, okay, how are we going to be covering this? And the idea was that we're going to be like the referee. If this is a game, politics and policy are a game, we're going to be on the ground running with the different team players, giving them sometimes a red card or a yellow card. But we will be part of the game. We'll be like a referee. We won't take sides. We won't be commenting from far away, but we won't be pro-European or anti-European. We won't be German or French. And we had one big objective, going back to Kissinger's famous remark, who do I call if I want to speak to Europe? Which, is still a great question. And 6 years in, we're really happy that Secretary Pompeo, President Erdogan, Nicola Sturgeon from Scotland, when they want to actually address the town, they do come and speak to us and give us exclusive op-eds because they know that everyone in the EU Commission and Council is reading us. But the narrative of covering 27 different countries every morning and how their politics is working out in English for a community, it is a very different journalistic exercise than obviously covering Washington, which is also a lot of tribes in Washington, I must say, but.
Yes, there are many tribes in Washington. Well, obviously, Politico Europe is as a must read inside the ring road in Brussels as it is inside, Politico is inside the Washington Beltway. But one thing I wanted, you already started getting into this, how, you know, you're reaching out and how the leaders in Europe now are coming to you and you know, want to have an exclusive with you. But how about some of the media markets that are a little farther afield in Europe? Do you see differences between you know, the former members of the Warsaw Pact, the Eastern European and Central European countries, and the countries to the West? I guess we used to say old Europe, new Europe, but I don't want to say that. I'm
no. Actually, the last 4 years really exasperated kind of this different media, and it'll be really interesting to see, by the way, what's going to happen in the coming months. So the national media, the Western national media, maybe the French media, Spanish, German, they actually belong to proper publishers or some industry captains, such as the Dassault family, which also own make some fighter planes. But so you've got actual industrial families or proper publishers such as Axel Springer or Bertelsmann who own these publications. Eastern Europe, it's more and more, a lot of it is state-owned. And today, actually, one of our top stories is the media freedom in Hungary, Poland, and Slovenia are really getting a lot of attention. What has been fascinating in the past 4 years is how the Eastern European, many of these Eastern European state-owned publications were actually quite pro-Trump or pro-American at that period, compared to the Western media, more the UK-based or the French-based. And obviously, probably because there was similarity in thought with Donald Trump, with the past administration. Security, you know this more than I do, they are dependent on the US. They do believe US is the key alliance for them. And we're quite fascinated to see how the pivot, their narrative will pivot with Biden administration. And how these state-owned media in several Eastern European countries will be covering the story of US politics and the US administration. Because in the last 4 years, there's been a huge divide between many Eastern European media and the Western media. And it's been fascinating to see that divide in the narrative. And the pivot, I know our newsroom will be covering more the media of Eastern Europe and how they're going to be working on the narrative.
Very interesting. For those of you who are watching today, if you'd like to ask a question, you can post your question in the Q&A or in the chat if you prefer, and I will turn to them after a little while after our fireside chat is over. But please do be thinking ahead about your questions. Tomorrow, the NATO Defense Ministerial starts up at NATO headquarters. It will be the debut for the new Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin of the United States. And there will be some urgent decisions for them. They will have to talk about what's going to happen with Afghanistan and with Iraq, with the withdrawal of troops already announced in those two operations, what to do about it from a NATO perspective. Here in the United States, the headlines have mostly been about US troop withdrawals from those two countries, but it is a matter for NATO as a whole. So I wanted to ask you, Scheherazade, how is this going to be covered in Europe? Do people there care about what's happening with the operations in Afghanistan and Iraq? Do people care about these issues of security that NATO is so focused on? Or are people just so wrapped up in the pandemic and in dealing with COVID-19 that really it's been not so much an issue from the perspective of your readers, from the perspective of your publics?
No, definitely. I would say compared to the importance of the discussion, which is the troops, and there isn't the level of attention that you would expect in a normal world without COVID. Right now, we're having huge vaccine issues. There's a scandal in Europe. The EU institutions, actually the Von der Leyen, the president of the commission, is under attack so that remains the big story. Having said that, what is very interesting, I asked someone at the office to monitor also all the national media today and the meeting is not up in the news, so you have to look for it. It's not on the homepage of Figaro. You really have to go in Welt and others, so it's not up there. We'll see tomorrow. What is interesting is I believe there has been also a vow that the administrations will be working more closely together on defense issues. And what I thought was also didn't get maybe, and would love to hear you on this, is the Secretary General of NATO, who today gave up that he would like to discuss the alliance's strategy for the next decade. And he mentioned China and Russia, and we'll talk about this later on. And the China topic is out there. Now at NATO it's mentioned. And that may be actually on the more strategic view is going to get some coverage, because the EU-China and US-China relation is getting a lot of coverage. And when I saw that the Secretary General Stoltenberg mentioned that as part of what he wants to include in the strategic decisions, I think that may suddenly get more coverage than maybe the troops. So that's my guess, because but the pandemic is really on top of the agenda, and I don't know if everyone is aware, but the vaccination campaign has not really worked out well in Europe right now. So, and EU, as usual, is the scapegoat, under attack, responsible for not ordering enough doses, and that remains the headline story, including for us.
Yes, I'm afraid, sadly enough, it's a headline story in many states of the United States as well, in addition to the dire weather that is dumping snow in parts of Texas that haven't seen snow for decades. So it's been a tough week from a number of perspectives.
One thing, if I may add, Rose, I think with the NATO summit, we're very curious, and we're covering this quite a bit, is Macron and how he put out the French president beyond saying that NATO is brain dead, but he's been pushing for European sovereignty and defense, as you know. And we think that narrative will lose momentum because of a much more forceful and that the US and NATO will be having a much stronger position together. So that narrative, which also came out in the past couple of years because of the Trump administration, it's going to be very interesting to see if Macron and the French media will be able to keep that on the agenda of the talks.
Yes, and I think it's also interesting how the relationship with Europe, between Europe and Russia, is at a bit of a crossroads now as well, with Macron being very keen, to reach out to Vladimir Putin. Of course, the behavior of the Russian regime has been really terrible with regard to the jailing of Navalny and the cyber attacks, very evident in the United States, but I know they've affected many other countries as well. So there are a lot of issues out there that I think are changing the thinking of European leaders. In fact, if you'd like to comment on the relationship, because the EU has also just had a run-in with the Russians, and how important that was from the perspective of the European Union. I think it was important from a policy perspective, but how do your readers think about these issues of the relationship with Russia?
I think what we're seeing, and this is again our perspective from Brussels. So the Borrell, who's the commissioner in charge of EAS, European External Actions, was kind of humiliated by Lavrov last week during his poorly planned visit to Moscow. Our view from Brussels has been, first of all, there was an upheaval of MEPs who wanted his resignation. But secondly, that visit brought a lot of, in all the top national media, there was op-eds. Is there a common foreign policy at the European Union? Or is EEAS just another institution without any power? Because Borrell, at the end of the day, had no legitimacy to go and see Lavrov, because France is going to do their own policy. Germany has their own policy. And this is true, by the way, with China, which is going to be at the center. And I think both China and Russia will be at the center of the US-EU relations somehow. But it was really a very, in French we would say, ça a fait couler de l'encre. There was a lot written about this trip in national media, in Brussels, and trying to understand, did the EU have the right approach, and is the Europe's Commissioner for Foreign Policy, does he have any power to represent the 27 countries today?
Oh, fascinating. Indeed, that debate has been out there for a long time, but I've been, during my time at NATO anyway, it seemed to me that the EU and External Action Service was making progress because there had been some effective participation in policy in recent years. You can agree or not with the JCPOA and what was done to reach out to the Iranians and try to get a handle on their nuclear program, but there was quite a vital role that the EU External Action Service played in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I fully agree. In the past in the past 2 weeks, it's just been really, we're back at a very bad place. And obviously in the past year of Venezuela, where the EU was unable to come up with a common statement even, they could not come up with a statement. So there's been a year which, and really since the Trump administration in a way, there hasn't been any big action that the EEAS has been able to deliver on. And in the past 2 years, it has not been very effective. The last couple of weeks with Lavrov, with the visit of Borrell to Moscow, it really did question a lot where Europe's foreign policy is going, and if there is a EU foreign policy at least.
If there even is such a thing. That's fascinating. We have a question from Marcos Kounalakis. Could you touch on how the narrative around Turkey has evolved? It's a NATO member, it has a large diaspora in the EU, particularly in Germany, a nation that met the conditions of membership for the EU, but now with an authoritarian leader. So can you talk about Turkey in the European context and again, how the story is evolving as you see it?
The narrative with Turkey will always be a narrative that will include Europe's Islam problem or issue, depending on how you want to see it, because Erdogan's visits have always, he's played a key role in having visits to very strong Muslim movements within Europe. So every time and the second narrative is obviously going to be around immigration and migration. So every time there's a coverage, every time of Erdogan, it is a negative coverage, to be very clear. The narrative is negative around Erdogan. He definitely shows his muscles, including in op-eds he writes about what is due to him. And it's a problem in, I believe, the way France was trying this summer to come up between Cyprus and, there was a lot of negotiations every time, which again delayed some of the decisions. But the narrative, especially in the German media, is definitely extremely negative. Also because there are a couple of journalists who are in prison, and a couple are correspondents, even though they're Turkish, of European media. This is purely from the European, I would say from a media side, I'm giving you the narrative rather than the political analysis, I would say.
You mentioned that Erdogan likes to put out public messages with a lot of muscle behind them. Have you seen anything more from him recently on on nuclear weapons and Turkey. That was
No.
raising quite a few eyebrows in
Interesting.
2019. My last year at NATO, he was beginning to make some
Interesting.
noises, but you haven't seen that lately.
No.
That's not part of
Interesting.
his. Okay, all right, very good. That's excellent
That's
from my
good.
perspective. Let's turn back again to China, because again, you already raised this. Is the Russia and the EU and NATO relationship with China and with Russia, is this going to be the big story going forward? But I'm very curious. For some time, NATO has been watching the U.S. pivot to Asia. That started out during President Obama's time in office, and since has become, it was interrupted, seriously interrupted by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the threat of Islamic extremism with the rise of ISIS, of Daesh. So from 2014 until the last couple of years, I think there was a lot of continued attention on security in Europe, but now the security situation with regard to China is catching US attention again. And also NATO and the EU are both thinking about how they should relate to China. So I'm interested in how you see that. And again, if you could give us a sense for how your readers think about this and whether it's a top priority for them.
It's definitely a top priority. Just as Politico, we've invested in launching a EU-China newsletter, a weekly newsletter. We've recruited actually South China Morning Post's correspondent to Brussels has just joined Politico, Stuart Lowe. He knows the topic extremely well. He's so happy to be with us. So he joined us, and he's launching a newsletter as of 8th of March, I believe. And it's a free newsletter, so covering the EU-China story. Ever since he's joined us, he's writing on tech, on environment, on trade, because China is omnipresent. And we do see it as the biggest story. And it will be it may be the biggest story in the next transatlantic relation also. And right now there's a feeling that, and there's a lot of articles in, again, national and international, and for our readers on Europe right now may not want to choose sides between the United States and China, but at some point it will. And this is going to, and that's where we're going to be back, like it or not. Its leaders will eventually have to choose sides. And the choice will be stark. The US, it's either go with the US or become an international sideshow, the Europeans don't want to really hear that, but the political and business leaders, they're writing a lot, they're pushing a lot for different narratives. And some don't want to have a confrontation with Washington on this topic. Others don't want to have a confrontation with China. There's a lot of confusion about where the EU is heading with China, to be very candid. There is confusion because we have 27 different countries, and Germany and France have their view of, this could be a provocation of China. So it's going to be a ménage à trois, the US-EU relation. There will definitely be China in the relation. And I think it's going to affect a lot the narrative also.
It's interesting that you are getting opinion input from people who really see it as a zero-sum game, as I understand you, that if China wins in Europe, US loses and is pushed out, kind of, if I'm reading you correctly.
Exactly, and it'll be absolutely.
But that's interesting because in the Asia Pacific, where China and the US have long coexisted, it's a very competitive relationship, clearly. There can be elements of cooperation. I, for one, am hopeful that the US gets back into the game in terms of trade negotiations in the Pacific, because it basically left the stage and gave all of the action to China, and we see the results now in some of the progress on trade agreements that's been made, including, by the way, with the EU. But I don't necessarily see it as a zero-sum game. The
Okay.
United States has to be in the game, but I don't see it as a zero-sum game. Why do you think so much of that attitude?
I think so. Maybe some of this has also coming back to the Donald Trump administration with some of the trade issues. This is the first year that China is going to replace the U.S. as the first trade partner of EU. This is the first year. 2020 will be the first year. And from the 5G procurement, that was a beginning of a real with Huawei security issues. So there has been an understanding for the German. Right now, Germany really depends on China for a big part of its economy. China's relation with France is quite different. And it's not very clear how each country would like to negotiate and if they want to be fully following the US leadership in the trade and in the negotiations. And I think the 5G procurement, where that kind of showed when some countries were allowing Huawei, others weren't, and that really brought a whole new dimension to, is the US deciding what we can do with China? So it will be a tension point, maybe not a zero-sum game, but we have a lot. It's a big narrative right now on how that's going to.
Well, again, it'll be incumbent on the United States to be present, to be playing in the game, to make it not so much of a zero-sum type of encounter or interaction. We have a related question on China, very interesting question from Perry Bloom, and that is, what is the European media saying about the British decision to ban China's CGTN and the tit-for-tat Chinese decision to ban BBC World News in China? What do you anticipate how will this develop? What will be ultimately the outcome?
Yeah, that's a great question. Do you know, it's having media, we have a joke in Brussels, we say we're the largest media. However, we're the largest media after the Chinese newswire agency, but then we say, but we're not sure there are media with us. So I do think, for you to know, for a media company to have an activity in China is something Politico never really looked into.
Oh dear, we seem to have lost Scheherazade. Are you there, Scheherazade?
The journalists. So, hello?
Yes, you froze on us there for a
me?
moment. So yeah, I can hear you now. Could you back up and just say the last couple of sentences again?
No, so I was saying that as a media, to run a media, you don't want journalists on the ground in China in general, because and it's something Politico never wanted to have, actually on ground presence in China, because we know it can be very dangerous. But on the ban, I think I'm not sure it will last long, but that's a very personal opinion. I think it's news for the day.
I want to remind our viewers and our participants today that the question time is open, so you can post your question in the Q&A section or to the chat if you would prefer to do it that way. I wanted to follow up as a next question about the balance of coverage between NATO and the EU. We touched on this earlier because we talked about the fact that the upcoming NATO Defense Ministerial that starts tomorrow is not going to get, well, in your view, it's not making headlines. Not today, probably not tomorrow. I do think it's a good thing that perhaps Lloyd Austin, as the new Secretary of Defense, will have a chance for a quiet entry into NATO headquarters and some serious discussions, because there are some serious decisions to be made. and probably best out of the media limelight. So that's I think a good thing. But tell me how you think about the balance of coverage between NATO and the EU, because EU was always a source of such juicy gossip when I was in Brussels, but it was never much interesting. There was never much interesting coming out of NATO, at least as I saw it as DSG. So tell me how you think about covering the two organizations.
So it's, first of all, it's a numbers game. You have many more people working in the EU, the Parliament and the Council. I think adding up, it's over 40,000 people work in those three institutions compared to around what at the headquarters at NATO, you're around 4,000. So we are about readership, right? So that is part of it. Second of all, and I think it's something you probably lived like me, moving to Brussels, and it goes back to your first question about Washington. I was amazed how in Brussels there are silos. There is the silo of the EU, there's the silo of NATO, there's the silo of the actually Belgian people living, who'd never know that NATO's there or the EU is there. While in Washington, you have the security, the policymakers. It's a much more closer community. We do feel that for covering NATO, it requires a much more technical and much more specific kind of coverage. We are hoping to actually increase by having 2 reporters full-time cover NATO. We do cover a lot, the Secretary General, yourself, when you were there, but at a higher level, at a more strategic level. Also interested often in the tension point with Turkey and the EU. That was obviously one of the topics that for the EU bubble we always like to cover, because it was part of the EU story of always the Greeks and Turkish. So that came on. I do think what was also very interesting during the past administration, under the Trump administration, was the difficulty to cover NATO, because actually often what the narrative would come out of Washington anyways the next morning of a NATO meeting or before a NATO meeting. So that also, I think, and we're only 6 years old, so I think that also influenced maybe our lack of coverage, which can definitely change with the new administration.
Yes, I think we won't have so much news making via Twitter. At least I hope not. I have a question, interesting question from Dan Zhukov, who asks, there's been renewed interest and there have been renewed talks recently about the establishment of a global tax on the US big tech companies under the auspices of the OECD. Could you comment on the narratives and reactions surrounding this development? And how do your readers foresee this affecting the relationship with the United States overall?
It is a great question, because we cover a lot, obviously, tech and the big tech, and from all aspects, from privacy to tax to the role, obviously, they're playing in democracy in general. So on the tax issue and OECD, so I think there's a lot of interest to know, where does the Biden administration stand on big tech? And it's going to be extremely interesting also to know if the big tech will remain the GAFAM, or we will start seeing a real separation between the Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft, and if they will take different routes, from tax to publishing rights and so on. Obviously, the recovery plan, I always say, when you spend so much money, then you've got to find some money. And so there maybe some money has to be found also in these companies. But there's a lot of interest in understanding where Biden's administration really stands in their relation with the tech. And again, the past administration, it was quite erratic, like everything else. It wasn't very clear. But it's definitely a topic of high interest for both us, international media, Brussels-based media, and the national media. And they're under fire on so many fronts. So.
Yes, I'm sure the business media is paying close attention to that as well.
Yeah.
Could you just, before we go on to the next question, just comment a word or two on the balance of coverage in Politico Europe? Do you cover the business beat as well, or do you leave that to
No.
The Economist and
No,
Financial
we're really
Times
about politics and policy, very niche politics and policy. And we don't really cover the effects on the stock market. We will be covering, obviously, the tax, because that is a policy issue, and the EU has been pushing, as Trump used to call Vestager, the tax lady, for anti-competition and different topics. So tax is definitely, but we will not cover the business side. We're very much obsessed about privacy topics, about how the data flows will continue working. We've just launched another newsletter, which is going to go on for a couple of months, which is called The Bridge, the Digital Bridge. And we launched this on on the first day of the Biden administration. So this is also a weekly newsletter bringing together the biggest topics between Washington and Brussels around digital, about the tech, including the tax. Again, it's a free newsletter, so welcome to read it. It's weekly. And we're covering the story on both sides of the Atlantic.
That's very interesting. But you said you thought it would be a temporary phenomenon, this newsletter. So do you think you'll kind of unwind it if things begin to settle into regulatory policy and that type of thing?
Yeah. Yes, what we're trying to do is really to understand what our readers want, is what is going to be the bridge. Mm-hmm. We're back into a relationship here. And initially we launched it as a understanding where the Biden administration is going and how that's going to interplay with Europe's agenda on digital.
I see.
It may continue. We'll see. It depends on readership and on the story, but it was a little bit for the first 100 days because there's a lot of interest understanding.
Okay, very interesting. Christophe Crombe asks, you mentioned that national governments often use the EU as a scapegoat. National media often enhance this perception. Political Europe is very well read within the Brussels bubble. Does it have the ambition of increasing its readership to people outside the bubble who currently receive their information mainly from national media, and thus changing the narrative in the EU? It gets back to a bit to what we were discussing earlier, but yeah, how do you get beyond the Brussels bubble? That's always the question, isn't it? Sure.
Absolutely. There's two sides, and I won't bore this audience with it. So there's two sides to this question. First of all, our main audience absolutely is actually today UK, Brussels, US, believe it or not, in that order. Then Germany, France, Italy, and then the rest of Europe. So we're definitely read by these very specific communities. We are very keen to have a more readership in Europe. We are rather niche publication, as I sometimes call us. So not for a general public, for a general public, but with high interest in politics and policy. We have just launched a playbook in French called Paris Playbook. So that's going to be in French, and it's our first venture into another language than English for a morning newsletter. It's an important venture and it's been so very successful for the moment, of trying to more connect the dots between the different capitals in Europe. But it's definitely, I was saying there's two sides to this question, because there is a side which is about running a publication and making sure you know how to make it a sustainable business. As you know, media is a difficult business to be in. And for it to remain sustainable, we have to have a very clear audience and a very clear coverage area. So politics and policy of the European Union, of Europe, since UK has left us, we're keen to say Europe, of Europe. And we need to put limits within actually our audience, because the larger the audience, the more diluted actually the positioning of the media and it can become less sustainable. But so there is a business reason why we also are quite niche.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested, though, talk about niches. I'm not aware of the use of that kind of publication, like a newsletter in the Paris media market. Is it so far popular? You said it's doing well so far.
12,000 subscribers, and many in the Élysée Palace and in different places. So we're very happy about that. Very
Excellent.
happy. Yeah, it's bringing some hype to the town. So which was the
Very good. Well, let's circle back. We talked about the China relationship with the EU, and we talked a bit earlier on about the problems that Monsieur Borrell had in his trip recently to Moscow. But could you say a few more words about how you see the relationship between the EU and Moscow, and the relationship with the United States and Washington at the same time? I take it there's probably not the same zero-sum kind of tendencies that you point to in the China relationship, but why don't you just compare those? You know, China, Russia.
Yeah, I think yeah, and it goes back a little bit about maybe the future of transatlantic relationship, because it's going to be a new normal. It's going to be different than the old normal. And there are many people who feel it's just not Donald Trump's administration that damaged maybe the transatlantic bond. And if you go down that route, sorry, 1 second, you can't, there won't be an immediate repair. And to China, and so there, the 5G procurement I talked about, that kind of brought the relation with China. And then there is obviously the gas imports, Nord Stream. That's going to be, it's still on the agenda. That has not gone away. And so these points of discord are highlighting that EU members have their own economic interests, and some of them distinct, and they have distinct agendas for China and Russia. And so, to be fair, this isn't only about the past administration, and these kind of different economic interests between the European countries amongst themselves will probably create a huge difficulty for them to agree amongst themselves to have a full alignment with the US on Russia. So I think that's going to be the difficulty, is how much and to what level of alignment is there expected to be from the European Union with the US on China and Russia, knowing that each country has distinct issues. And sure, human rights is always there. We talk about it, but Nord Stream is even more there. We talk a little less about it, but it's a big issue.
Yes, and there are some countries, of course, who care more about Nord Stream than others.
Absolutely, so. Absolutely. So, and that's why I like to always say 5G gas imports, is that how much alignment can you get from all of the EU countries to then get alignment with the new administration? And these are, again, stories we're covering quite in detail in Politico, obviously, and with and people have a lot of interest, at least the policy readers we have are following these topics extremely closely.
Let's stay for a minute on Biden's efforts to reestablish the transatlantic bond. We've been talking about it. It's been woven throughout our conversation this morning, but how sympathetic is the coverage going to be of that effort, do you think? And how, I guess the gist of the question is, how much will Europeans, the leadership establishment in the European countries, and indeed the publics in their reactions, how much will they be willing to help in this attempt to rebuild the transatlantic bond?
On the narrative, it's already changed for a lot of reasons. First of all, Washington is back. There was a coup in Myanmar, in Burmany, and in 2 seconds, you have Tony Blinken make a statement, Jake Sullivan make a statement, and you have all the correspondence of the European media in Washington covering what Washington is saying. So there, the narrative is already, just because Washington is showing much more energy on the international presence, already in the media, in the European media, you do feel that the US is quite strongly back. Second of all, John Kerry, Tony Blinken, they're Francophone. They know the media in town, in the different towns. They know the leaders in the different towns. So you can feel a proximity, and their presence is already quite strong in the media. Then, to be candid, the foreign correspondents in Washington are delighted. They're covering more this administration on a much better light, obviously. So all of this is putting back. So the US is now owning the narrative again in a very different way than Donald Trump. They're really owning the narrative. I also understand from my newsroom that the media hubs that were owned by the State Department in various parts of Europe are being ramped up. This is something that Donald Trump had ramped down. So you can definitely feel that at least the new administration wants to make sure that it's felt that they're back and they want to have this transatlantic discussion. I think what's going to be very interesting is you still have, and Rose, you know this kind of love-hate relation somewhere in Europe with the US sometimes, especially in France and in the media. And it'll be interesting to see how all the sovereignty topics that in the past 2 years, EU sovereignty became a big topic. We need our own army, we need our own vaccines, we need our own food. So there's been a big sovereignty call out, which was helped by the Donald Trump administration, where it was a moment for Europe to stand on its own. It'll be very interesting to see if the different leaders will be able to keep that narrative in their own media and in international media. So, but you can definitely see there's a professionalism coming back out from Washington, which is very welcomed by the media. Now, some people will tell you Biden doesn't have the aura of a Kennedy or of an Obama to, come and move the, but maybe that's fine also. So we'll see.
Well, I like your comment that the U.S. is owning the narrative again with its efforts to get out there. They have done things like reestablishing the daily press briefings in the White House and in the Department of State, over in the Defense Department. And again, it's, you are getting as best as official media, briefings can be. At least you're getting the official line on a regular basis, and then the media can, of course, question it and poke at them. But it becomes a lively, one hopes, a lively discussion. And I really think that that's been an important step that they've taken to restore those daily briefings. I think it's been really effective in them owning the media.
Absolutely, and that has actually just it's just like a wave. It's out here because the correspondents, all of the correspondents in Washington, are covering it, and this is worldwide. It's beyond the transatlantic relation.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So it's very smart, and you feel that leadership is back. What does that mean for President Macron, who was seeing himself in a, so there is those tension points you feel are going to be there.
Yes, indeed. Oh, one other thing I just wanted to mention about both Kerry and Blinken is they speak French quite well, which helps quite a bit for the Francophone population.
Very well.
Yes, exactly. I guess Tony went to school. I didn't realize that till I was seeing his bio as he was getting ready to be confirmed, that he had actually gone to school and lived in France for some time. So speaks.
We went to the same high school, not at the same time.
Really? Excellent. There you go. You're a fellow alumni. We have another question from Perry Bloom that takes us back to the issue of China. And it is related to the human rights questions. You've touched on these a bit, but this is more specific. How are European nations and their respective national media balancing the tension between human rights issues in China, such as Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, etc., and the burgeoning trade relationships? How do they respond when China reiterates its standard position that any criticism on these human rights issues is inappropriate interference in the internal affairs of China. By the way, we hear the same thing from Russia, right? Telling them anything critical about Navalny is inappropriate interference in their internal affairs. But nevertheless, let's stick on China for the moment.
No, it's a great question. And I don't know, Barry, I'm happy to send you a couple of articles. So when the EU-China trade agreement got delayed because of France, France, as you know, at the EU, you have to have all 27 vote on something to go through. And because of actually human rights. And it became very difficult. So France did not ratify the agreement for a couple of weeks. They finished up doing it, but they did not do it for human rights issues. There was a lot of pressure then put on France and got through. I think it was more a question for them to make it a point. But it is getting the attention it gets. But at the end of the day, it is not. There hasn't been anything worthwhile, to be honest, on the human rights, other than the media covering the story. The only notable topic was the fact that France stood up in a way for a couple of weeks before on the trade agreement. The national media is extremely covering, obviously, the Uyghurs, and it's an ongoing topic. There is not one article. Again, same with Turkey, same with Russia. And what's going to be very interesting, I think, down the road is, will we at some point, the same way with the climate change, the same way with privacy, we suddenly realize these things are really important. I do feel there is a much bigger movement today around human rights and trade than there were maybe 30 years ago. Some people questioning business diplomacy. And these are topics which I'm not sure we saw as much in the media. We were covering as much than 20 years ago, which was given that business diplomacy was the best way to handle it.
This question, I'm afraid, is going to be with us forever, but I do appreciate the fact that the media has been covering so many of these stories so regularly, both there in Europe, but also in the United States, the Uyghurs, and it's. I think we just have to keep shining light on the issue. There's no question.
And that's really the role of the media. It does remain a key role of the media, and the realpolitik does pick up on it right after a while. So.
Well, we have time for one more question, Scheherazade, and I'm going to ask it. You know, all of the time that I was in Europe at NATO, we were constantly focusing on, not NATO per se, but the press was focused, the public's on Islamic extremism. We, of course, at NATO were focused on the fight against terrorism through our operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and very concerned about the matter overall. But in the United States recently, the focus has shifted more, sadly, I have to say, to domestic acts of terror, domestic acts of violence against inside the United States and against U.S. citizens. Can you say, or has your media begun to cover such things in Europe? Do you see any danger that the horrors of Islamic extremism, as we've seen just this year on the streets of Paris, that dreadful situation where the teacher was decapitated, you know, these dreadful acts of terror. Is there anything else going on with regard to domestic terrorism? In the case of the populations inside Europe, I suppose in some ways these acts of Islamist terrorism are domestic terrorism. But on the other hand, what I'm talking about is related to domestic grievance of a different kind. And are you seeing any of that in Europe?
No, and Rose, I don't remember if you were in France, in Europe when we had the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests.
Yes.
That was a little bit of a domestic. It was a beginning, and you know they had some of them were trained, because this was a very strange story linked a little bit to Russia, to be honest, because clearly part of it were really workers who were upset, and part of it was extremely violent, clearly trained militia, the black box that they called them, that were sent in, and they were the ones really, and they were armed. So with the recession, which I mean, there is not a recession, but right now the pandemic is really hurting people. The stock market is doing well, the large organizations are doing well, but we have entire millions of people who are on the sidelines, and people are expecting, you know, some kind of violence. In France, the latest poll showed that Marine Le Pen, who's from National Front, will be in the second round, and she'll do quite well. She won't win the elections, but she can go up to 48%. She barely got 32 last time. So this is all linked. Obviously, then there is the Islamic terrorism, which is domestic. And the recent, I think the examples you're giving are recent. What's saving us in Europe is that people can't get armed easily. That's one thing. To get an arm is still quite difficult, but it's difficult. It's definitely an area of concern. And in the past year, understanding what is a Islam of Europe, which is something, again, in France, there's a lot of discussion because France and Belgium and Germany don't agree on, is there a European Islam? Or is this Islam funded by Turkey, by the Salafists, by the Saudis? So Europe is trying to kind of take control of its Islamic, of its Muslim population, in order to keep some of this violence at least domestic and not, I would say, trained by outside countries. But I do think, and from what I understand, at least in countries such as France, for the elections, they are concerned. And the Yellow Vest movement was quite, I mean, I must say, when I saw the Capitol the other day, it did remind me 2 minutes of the Arc de Triomphe, which was destroyed, which is a symbol of French Republic. And that was unseen. So.
This has been a fascinating conversation, Scheherazade. Thank you so very much. I certainly learned a lot myself and was brought up to date on many issues that sadly, way out here in California, I had lost track of. And I am sorry to those who did not get their questions answered, but we are out of time. But I just wanted to express my appreciation. No. And on behalf of the Stanford and West Coast audience, it's so important that we understand about the environment in Europe and what's happening now as President Biden seeks to reestablish the transatlantic bond, but also bringing in so many issues to do with China, Turkey, and other countries in the neighborhood was very, very enlightening for us all. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much for having me, Rose. It was a pleasure to see you. And if any of the participants ever pass by Brussels in the normal world, please do ping me and I'll be delighted to show you around Politico. So
thank you very much. And for the listeners and viewers today, if you want some really piquant coverage of Europe, I strongly recommend Politico Europe. It's excellent. And you can really get a lot of the inside gossip, as I said. Yeah. So that's also well worthwhile. So thank you again, Scheherazade.
Thank you so much, Rose.
Merci, au revoir.
Merci beaucoup. Have a nice day. Thank you so much. Thanks, Rose.